everyone.
Good evening. Good evening. How's everyone today?
Yeah. We get to see you and Camille. It's awesome.
Well, you're not here to see me, but I'm Jyoti Nanda. I teach here at the law school. I know some of you, but not all of you. I teach in the Critical Race Studies program. And I think I'm here in my capacity today. I wear a lot of hats in the law school, but I think I'm here in my capacity today as the co-founder and director of the Youth and Justice Clinic. The first partner with our Youth and Justice Clinic was an organization called Mental Health Advocacy Services, which is an organization here in Los Angeles that focuses on mental health and raising awareness and doing advocacy around mental health for adults and children. So I think that's my hat that I'm going to wear today as to why I'm here. And I wanted to start, before I introduce you to our speaker today, I wanted to start by saying, just before I got to campus today, I was driving in Westwood and I saw a billboard that many of you may have seen that really struck me. And it says, "Battling a nationwide struggle of the invisible wounds of war." I don't know if you've seen it. It's on a couple of the bus stops in Westwood. And it's an acknowledgement that for many vets returning from war, the beginning of the battle is about to begin as they struggle mentally and physically. And I started to think about how, as a society, we've really come a long way. I mean, we haven't gone as far as we need to, but we've come a long way in discussing PTSD and the effects of sort of war mentally and physically on people's minds and on people's brains. But I thought we haven't yet really found a way to discuss mental health generally as a society, and there's still very much an uncomfortableness around it. So we can sort of say, post-war, we can kind of understand the impact. But we can't talk about it if there wasn't really necessarily a war. We're still very uncomfortable with that. And then I thought, well, we do know a couple of things about mental health and policing. We do know more than we did even just a few years ago. Thanks to the Washington Post that's been sort of collecting, right, all this data. And those of you that were at our CRS symposium last year remember hearing from the reporter who talked about how they decided to start a database on the Washington Post to collect sort of the stories around policing as a way to sort of track if they started to see trends. And so it's really credit to the Washington Post for doing that. That at least a quarter of the individuals killed by police shootings this year had histories of mental illness. And I'll leave it to the expert to sort of talk about that. But that really struck me, that there was a quarter. Responding to a call for erratic behavior should often trigger a response by individuals with training in mental health, but sadly that's not often the case. So I thought then today's talk could be a billboard that reads, "Battling a nationwide struggle of the invisible wounds of the police." I wondered if that would sort of ever make a billboard. Maybe. Yeah. And with that, you're in for a treat today. We're fortunate today to have someone here who can discuss the delicate layering of issues of policing, rape, and mental health, which each and of themselves are nuanced and complex and layered. Camille Nelson, better than most, if not all, writes things and discusses these issues in a way that really captures the delicate intersection of these issues. And I'm delighted to introduce her today and honored. Before I talk about Camille Nelson, I want to first acknowledge and thank the co-sponsors and visionaries of this event, which are two UCLA alums. So Dr. Beth Rebay, who's a UCLA CRS graduate, and Claudia Pena, who's a UCLA CRS and PILT graduate, who founded an organization called Repair. And it's an organization that engages in research, education, and community-level advocacy regarding health challenges, health disparities, and disabilities that result from social problems. Part of their mission is to link research, education, and advocacy in order to build well-informed interventions that challenge the problems we are concerned with, which is sort of what we're attempting to do today. And now about our guest of honor. So Professor Camille Nelson is a professor of law at Suffolk Law School, which is in Boston. For 5 years, she served as the dean of Suffolk. But before joining the law school, she served as professor of law at Hofstra. From 2000 to 2009, she was a member of the faculty of St. Louis University School of Law, where she was named Faculty Member of the Year in 2004 and received the Faculty Excellent Award in 2006. She's also been a visiting professor at other schools and scholar in residence. Following her undergrad education at the University of Toronto, Professor Nelson received her law degree from the University of Ottawa Faculty of Law and went on to receive a Master's of Law from Columbia Law School in New York. She clerked for Justice Frank, and Kabuchi, thank you, the Supreme Court of Canada, and also worked as an associate at one of the largest law firms in Canada. Professor Nelson is a member of the American Law Institute and widely recognized for her writings and lectures, which really focus on the intersection of critical race theory and cultural studies, with a particular focus, as you'll hear today, on criminal law procedure, health law, and comparative law. Some of her professional accomplishments, I mean, I could go on and on, her bio is very long. Some of her professional accomplishments include that she was named to the Power 100 list of the most influential black lawyers in the country for 3 years straight. She was elected the 2014-15 co-president of the chief leadership body for the Law School of Deans. She was appointed to U.S. Senator Elizabeth Warren's Advisory Committee on Massachusetts Judicial Nominations, and she was honored as one of the top women of law by Massachusetts Lawyer Weekly. And above all, she is a friend and ally to those who care deeply about these issues. And with that, can you please join me in a warm welcome?
Thanks very much for that really kind introduction, and I love the way in which you contextualize the conversation I hope to have with you tonight. Thanks also to my dear friend and new friend for inviting me, Beth and Claudia. I'm really thrilled to be here. So one of the things that was mentioned was I served as dean for 5 years, and a lot of people think that it's a hard job, but I think actually doing this work in many ways is harder. And it's a real privilege for me to return to my scholarship, especially given everything that's been going on in the country over the last several years. But it's also, there's a way in which doing this work is so distressing. And so I'm going to talk to you about some of what I've been looking at. And I know many of you share my concerns about what is going on and in the lives of many people in this country. And I have the concern that I mentioned as a secondary concern is how this impacts the rest of us as well, and how should we be thinking about that in terms of vicarious impacts as well, in terms of coping and in addition to activism. So let me talk to you a bit about what the project that I'm embarking upon presently is about. So can you see, is it okay if with the lights in this, turn it down a bit? Okay, thank you. So I think most people in this country, and right now I'm on sabbatical in the Netherlands, indeed the world, are aware of the fatal police killings that have been taking place over the last couple of years, especially in this country. And there's the question of whether there's been an increased incidence or whether we just know more because of body cams and people with cell phones and PDAs and other devices that can capture audio and video simultaneously. Although it does seem, and I'll talk about this later, that the numbers are actually increased or have increased. So my central project is about what are the layers, the intersecting interdisciplinary layers that are operative in those instances of an encounter between a police officer and a quote-unquote suspect. And I'm particularly concerned if we tease out that fabric about racialization, and I use the language of negative racialization, because we're all racialized, right? White people are racialized, Asian people are racialized, mixed race people are racialized, Latino, everybody's racialized, right? African Americans are racialized, but not everybody is racialized negatively, and that's also contextual, and that's layered, and that's historical, and it's multidimensional. I recognize that. So let's explore some of these dynamics. Is at the heart of what I'm seeking to do. And when I talk about mental health as an intersecting status, I typically talk about it as mental vulnerability, as I've stated on the slide, because I see this as a fluid state that many people come into and come out of, both because of medication and treatment, but also because of context and frankly what's going on in their environments and in the world. So I think there's some fluidity there, like many statuses in terms of definition. So there are two phenomena, and I know I'm going quickly because I have a bunch of slides and I want to see what we can get through together, and maybe leave some space at the end if we have time for Q&A. The first phenomenon that I'm particularly concerned about is how the interactions between police and a quote-unquote potential suspect, or someone who is, in my language, being felonized, construct disability, right? How does that construct a disabling, societally disabling construct through which a person becomes impaired, right? Similarly, I look at the work that Dr. Ribe has engaged in, and others, around how disability is a construct. We know many people, including many people on your faculty here, have looked at race as a construct, and how those two constructs engage one another and layer upon each other and intersect one another. And I talk about this in the paper in terms of SIC, suspect identity construction, and how when we bring all of these dynamics and statuses or identities together, how often the ideal criminal suspect through race, sometimes gender, certainly sexual orientation and ability or disability is constructed. So what are the constructs? In terms of the on-the-ground engagement, I'm particularly concerned that a lot of these encounters between police and potential suspects also, quote unquote, debilitate the person who is being engaged. And I say that because there is an increasing amount of awareness around the impacts of racism, bias, prejudice in our lives, and the toll that takes on people in terms of stress, in terms of anxiety, in terms of paranoia, in terms of psychological impacts that are quote-unquote diagnosable or are observable in some way, right? And I'll cite to some of that literature later. So on the one hand, I'm concerned that people are being constructed as deviant in the absence of any manifest behavior, right? And on the other hand, I'm concerned that through these engagements, people are actually debilitated and disabled and stressed, and that cycles through their personal lives, but also through their families and communities, and query intergenerational and historical impacts as well, okay? So if I dig a little bit deeper into that, I'll flash some of the studies and the research that's out there up on the screen, but I'm trying to really look at these constitutive dynamics and to deal seriously with the theories around constructed identities, both racial and in terms of ability, disability, including mental health constructs. And I'm also trying to grapple with the reality that race itself, I don't want to be taken as saying because someone is negatively racialized or because someone, let's say, is black, they are inherently pathologized, right? That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that one's race as a marker makes them in any way less than. I'm saying it's the isms around their identities that are intentionally in many ways, or certainly unconsciously debilitating in an individual's life. And there is a deep historical anchor to that reality. Similarly, when we look at the increasing work that I think most of you are privy to now around unconscious bias and implicit bias, and the work coming out of both coasts, Harvard and Stanford, and here, you appreciate as well that not all of what people experience is intentional, and that there are multiple layers of consciousness or unconsciousness around those realities. And indeed, when you think about the Tamir Rice shooting, for example, we know that many people, when they see a black youth, they add 4 years on. So Tamir was 12, but the research tells us that people encounter black youth as 4 years older, and then combine that with the unconscious bias work being done around shooter bias, and you often have particularly deadly results. Now, I want to just back up over this slide, because I think it's important to talk, just even at this stage, before we get into some of the instances, about the, let me just move the mouse here, the information we know about the impacts of racism and isms on individuals. And I focused at this point in the presentation on the impacts that we know about racism in particular on black men. And you see some of the information here. And I understand there was a presentation recently on racism and cancer. Is that what you were telling me yesterday?
We did a community workshop.
A community workshop. So there's, and with respect to women, right? So there's a significant and burgeoning body of literature and information and research being done, not just about the physical sequelae of racism and discrimination, right? Cancer being a serious physical manifestation, but also increasingly around the mental toll that is taken upon people who are victims of oppression, right? And I mentioned Tamir. So the stress of racism is important and impactful in the life of the individual, but I've also alluded to intergenerational, third party, and what's being called historical trauma as well. So there has been an abundant sort of anecdotal editorializing, for example, blogging, Facebooking, tweeting about the impacts that people in the communities are experiencing from not just the actual shootings, but the constant relaying of the images and accessing the killings and seeing these images over and over and over and over and over again. And so people in the communities are starting to talk like, this is impacting me, how can I cope? And this is one article that talks about sort of where I started, saying this has taken me a long time because I can only go into this work every so often and then I have to come back out of this work. And that's just an anecdotal, and I might add, I don't need to trivialize it, but I recognize that I'm not being the victim of an encounter. But nonetheless, many people are starting to talk now about the ways in which they are impacted by what's been going on in this country. And so it begs the question of vicarious trauma. And I put this quote up here because, again, just going through the mass media, we have more and more commentators and psychologists now also talking about the fact that the continual relaying on our screens and our feeds of the constant images of people, black people in particular, being brutalized takes its toll. And in this particular example, someone says, maybe we should talk about yoga and how we deal with the barrage of these things, and maybe we need to just get away and turn off the TV, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And yet still we're not the ones in the encounter, but there are impacts. And I want to play this if I can, because I think, sometimes a little levity is helpful, but also because it's real in terms of the mental well-being of people who are not just in the scene, but who are witnessing these encounters. So let me see if I can actually do this. So this is this one.
Have you ever just wanted to call in black to work?
You heard what I said.
Call in black. I don't know if you can relate, but maybe your mornings are a little like mine. They usually go a little something like this. It's morning and your alarm rings. You hate mornings. But you're alive and employed, so you can't complain too long, right?
You're right.
Because you're a millennial, you instinctively begin scrolling through every news-feed board, and you slowly start to notice something.
Wait, what?
Another unarmed black person assaulted and or murdered. Your emotions and thoughts could run the gamut from hopeless and confused to infuriated and reckless. But the other day when I was driving to work and I noticed water randomly pouring from my eyes, I realized something. I was grieving. The specifics might differ. Swap a grown man with a teenage girl in a bathing suit, switch the Skittles for loud music, or not using your turning signal, or praying in a church, or walking. Every reblog, retweet, repost of citizen video footage that ultimately will never see the light of a courtroom. Every Vine you watch of someone you know from Twitter getting pepper sprayed, and every link to a racist GoFundMe page. Sure, the specifics might differ, but watching the same narrative play out over and over and over and over and over and over again takes a toll. Sometimes I need a minute, okay? And that's where calling in black would be so clutch. Oh no, it's not contagious. I need a solid day to reaffirm my humanity to myself, so see you tomorrow. Oh, no, it's not allergies. It's just, I just watched the police choke somebody to death and I know they're not going to go to jail for it, so see you at 11. I have a slight fever. Boiling with the rage of the police killing my people! Anyway, I want to hear from you. For y'all watching, what has been the emotional toll of the constant online consumption of black bodies getting systematically assaulted and or murdered? I look forward to your comments. My name's Evelyn, and I'll see you on the internet somewhere. Bye.
So, knowing that there are impacts, third-party impacts, intergenerational impacts, what does that do to an individual as well who is at some point then interacting with police down the road, right? So how does that impact one's psyche or mental well-being or mental health as well? Because there is documentation and research that supports the fact that stress is exacerbated as well because of fear. Fear of an encounter, fear of isms, fear of brutalization. Okay. There's an interesting body of research that I was looking at around the intergenerational impacts of genocidal histories, in particular First Nations histories, I'm Canadian, sir, American Indian, Indigenous, Aboriginal histories, right? And there's a burgeoning body of literature, especially around these communities, in terms of the implications in terms of this history, of these brutal histories in the present day. There's less of this research with respect to African American, Latino communities, but I think there are metaphors to be drawn between the work being done around Indigenous communities, First Nations, American Indian communities. And so that's one area of research that I think is worth pursuing to tease out commonalities and similarities. So, interesting in terms of how we can look at these interactions is literature around ecosystems. So looking at the interplay, intergenerational, historical, in terms of racism and class, and how that relates to what people of color encounter in their ecosystems. And if these ecosystems are toxic and historically anchored, the impacts are all the more disturbing. So taking literally the notion of embodiment, says this epidemiologist, we have to think about what that does to one's biology, right, but also how that implicates one's mental well-being or mental health. So eco-social theory thus posits that how we develop, grow, age, ail, and die necessarily reflects the constant interplay within our bodies of our intertwined and inseparable social and biological history. So what's our history, right? And there's some great work being done around historical public health that really situates social phenomena, including isms, be that racism, sexism, homophobia, ableism, in context as informing our well-being, mental and physical. And I really like this quote. So every social phenomena is the result of a historical process. That is, societal factors operating over a period of time. And so we have this sense of a history of disparate outcomes and disparate treatment for many people of color in this country. And so the question becomes, how does that inform where we are today, right? How do we get to quality of life laws that I know you're studying, right? How do we get to broken windows, right? How do we get to Terry stops? How do we get to what we've been seeing in many countries, cities rather, across this country, in terms of police engaging young men of color on the street frequently, often, and often lethally, right? How do we get there? So we know that from Professor Angela Davis that race has always played a role in our criminal justice system and presumptions and constructions of criminality. We also know that from many of the great scholars doing work here, and Michelle Alexander has done great work in Jim Crow and others as well. And I just want to float with you some history that is sort of a medical, legal history, and it seems almost like too ridiculous to be true. But I just want to float this and ask you what you think about it, and if it's at all relevant. So when I was in SLU, St. Louis University, I was part of a medical law center at the university, Center for Health Law Studies, and I was focusing on mental health. But as part of that, I came across Samuel Cartwright, who would later become the president of the American Medical Association. And like much of our medical history, right, it's infused with our biases and our isms of the day. And Dr. Cartwright came up with a couple of diagnoses that I wonder if they're relevant to some of what we're seeing today. The first one being drapetomania, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, which was the disease causing Negroes to run away. And the second one was diasthenia aethiopica. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, but rascality, insolence, the refusal to be appropriately deferential to one's owner or overseer. Now, do I think that police officers today are aware of these historical diagnoses that required whipping and brutalization and the use of force to quell these diagnoses? No. But do I think that history informs where we are today in terms of anchoring certain notions and how we transmit knowledge and bias? Yes. So historical sensitivity identifies certain operative social factors, right? So how do these realities, and I have a lot more research, and others have done far better research on other similarly ridiculous diagnoses, but how, if at all, do we deal with these historical dynamics? Are they relevant today, right? Forces us to reflect at the very least. To pay heed to context and to historical information, to situate ourselves in this ecosystem that I referenced before. So, where are we? So, it's interesting because I was just doing some research at the hotel today, and the number of people of color, black men in particular, that have been killed since the start of the new year just even went up since the 12 hours I've been here, right? Because, in addition to the Washington Post, The Counted, which is based out of the Guardian newspapers in England, is doing a similar count. And I'll talk about some of the information as well, as is another organization that has a website called Fatal Encounters. And of course, they started to keep track, and it's partially crowdfunded, but it's also crowdsourced rather, and verified through police reports, etc. But they started each of these databases, Fatal Encounters, the Washington Post, and the Guardian, to do this because we in this country did not have an official government-run database, right? So people are trying to cobble together this information. So 78 has gone up to 81, at least when I left the hotel, in terms of people that have been killed by police thus far this year. And we know that a disparate number of these individuals, let me show you something because I didn't have the California, I don't know if you can see it, but LA is the, hope you can see this, LA is the city with the most killings last year, and then it has a scattergram map. And each of these sites, you can click on the information and dig down into the facts of at least what's known about the killing. And you can see, let me come over here, let me see if I can do this. 2.92% white, 7.18% black, 3.5% Hispanic, 1.34% Asian Pacific Islander, 3.4% Native American, okay? And so I encourage you, these sites are actually really depressingly informative. And I want to play a video now if I can get this to work, so bear with me again. So, and this is from The Counted.
In August of 2014, after Mike Brown was shot by police officer Darren Wilson in Ferguson, Missouri, a lot of things about policing that had once been invisible to the majority of Americans suddenly jumped into view. How militarized our police had become over the last 2 decades was one. How some forces have been generating revenue through fines and fees in racially biased ways was another. But one of the most startling things, once people started trying to analyze and make sense of police violence, was the lack of data. No organization in the government or in the mainstream press had accurate, reliable numbers tracking how many Americans are killed by police each year. So we decided to count the cases ourselves. Some of what we found is probably not surprising. We found that lots of people die at the hands of U.S. law enforcement, about 3 a day. We found that black Americans are more than twice as likely to be killed by police than white Americans. And we found that, compared to other developed nations, the U.S. was an extreme outlier. But some of what we found probably is surprising. Did you know that nearly 50 Americans have died after police used less lethal taser weapons? Or that roughly 1 in 10 people killed were in the midst of a mental health crisis? Beyond the numbers, we found untold stories. Everyone knows Mike Brown's name, but few knew about William Chapman, who died under nearly identical circumstances in Portsmouth, Virginia in April. 3 months after we told his story, the officer who shot and killed him was charged with first-degree murder. We've also discovered trends. For example, we can now say that with 13 killings and a population of just 750,000, Kern County, California has the deadliest law enforcement in the country. And if you're wondering why it took so long for this issue to come to the fore, the fact is, for most Americans, outside of the occasional unwanted speeding ticket, the police only show up when they need them. If that's your reality, it's easy to quietly assume that if they kill anyone, that someone was a dangerous criminal who must have deserved it. Only by telling these stories and counting these cases do people begin to realize how much more complicated it really is. And after all this counting, at last the authorities have been forced to act. In October, the Department of Justice announced it would launch a pilot program to track killings nationwide. And earlier this month, the FBI announced that it would be revamping its data collection as well. What is still unclear is what will be done to stop it. This is the number of Americans killed by police in 2015. Right now, there's little to suggest 2016 will be any different.
Okay. And specific to, so I don't pop back into the PowerPoint, specific to mental health and the number of people who are killed, who have been killed, who are in the throes of a mental health crisis, or for whom the police had information from the call that brought them to it that they were suffering from a mentally debilitating situation. I have a specific clip about that, but the numbers vary between, in this, 10% to what this video is going to talk about, a quarter, as you know, as was mentioned earlier. And this is where I'm particularly focused and particularly troubled.
We need to stop destroying property here in the state of emergency.
Basically, it's just getting worse every day.
Well,
now it's this house is bad. It's a few real bad.
Ferguson is just a copy of what's going on in all of America.
This is for your safety.
Whether there's been an increase in unjustified use of force in this country is a very hard question to answer because, unfortunately, we don't have good data on the use of force. Police departments around the country fail to keep the most simple data, even data on how many people they killed.
This has led the Washington Post to start an investigation that tracks every fatal police shooting in 2015. It's already revealed stark differences between those numbers and what the FBI has reported. One reason for this discrepancy is that the reporting is voluntary. Less than 3% of the nation's 18,000 state and local police agencies have reported fatal shootings by their officers to the FBI. That translates to approximately 400 police shootings a year. In contrast, the Post investigation has already tracked that number just 6 months into 2015.
Now at 11, deadly officer-involved shooting.
Officer Tremino then fired multiple shots, a total of 5.
Officers say they had no choice but to open fire on a mentally disturbed man.
An officer was also injured.
And when I came in the house, the grocery was never put up. Went to sleep. I heard my back door just wide open. And he was standing out on the sidewalk. I told him, baby, come in, it's too cold.
Concerned about his mental state, Laval Hall's mother called 911 in the early hours of February 15th. A diagnosed schizophrenic, Hall had just returned from the hospital a week before.
Where do you go? I guess there. Where do you go? You gonna go home?
Yeah, but he had a problem with it. I'm scared. It's so hurt what's happening.
Okay. He's walking with a broom and he's walking around in his underwear. Every time I go near him, he walks away.
Hey, keep going, man! Hey, easy! Hey! Ah!
Most police are trained to deal with criminals, so they are trained to come into a situation, assess it very quickly, and gain control and command of the situation. And when you have a person in a mental health crisis, they often don't understand those kind of commands. It can be really hard to follow what a police officer is saying. It's loud, it's scary, so it can actually escalate a situation, make a person more likely to get upset or to lash out, and increase the chances of violence.
Get on the fucking ground here, dead! Get on the ground here, dead! Get on the ground! Put down on your back! Put down on your fucking back!
Laval Hall, who was 25 years old, died of gunshot wounds at the scene. He's one of more than 100 people killed in the midst of an emotional or mental crisis. That's nearly a quarter of all police shooting deaths so far this year. And like in so many cases involving the mentally unstable, the call to police was not to report a crime, but a cry for help.
This country used to have a better functioning system in terms of people with mental illness. Right now we have a system that doesn't treat and is under-resourced in terms of treating people with mental disabilities. And so now, too often, police departments are the ones who are called upon to do what is really a public health problem.
There was supposed to be this net that cared for people, that provided them with therapy and medication and housing, but we've been cutting our mental health system and all these supportive services that people need to do really well out of the hospital. But instead, we have a very limited array of services for people now, so many people fall through the cracks. A lot of people with mental illness and who keep coming into contact with the justice system, the police might respond to their home 10, 20, 30 times. This can be a really frustrating situation for the police if they're responding to the situation over and over again, and especially if they're doing everything right, if they're calming the person down, if they're taking them to the hospital to get care and they see that the person's actually not getting any better. Their jobs are getting really, really frustrating.
But some police departments have recognized this and are responding with specialized training, including bringing community members in to speak with the officers.
Both my mom and my brother were both diagnosed with mental health challenges. Get to the door, I hear yelling, I hear screaming, so I already know before I get in there's a bad situation. I have what I call the typical ethnic concept. I'm scared. I'm like, I call the cops. When they come, someone's gonna get hurt. Someone may get shot, someone's going to jail, so I'm freaking out. Because I don't want nothing to happen to my little brother, even though...
It's called Crisis Intervention Training, and the Oakland Police Department in California implemented it in 2011. It's just one of the techniques this department is using to bridge the gap between its officers and the public, a relationship that's been strained for decades.
Over the last 40 years or so, the dynamic of the city of Oakland has changed, where it got particularly hard hit with the crack epidemic and rise in violent crime, and that leading to OPD trying to do something about that by being pretty aggressive in our crime enforcement strategies.
One of the problems we have in this country is not just that the police use force excessively, but that they are enforcing low-level offenses unnecessarily and disproportionately in communities of color. There's many activities that if you were doing it in a white community, in an affluent community, you wouldn't be bothered. But if you're doing it in a community of color, you're going to be stopped, you're going to be frisked. In fact, even if you're not doing that activity in many communities of color, you're going to be stopped, frisked, and searched.
John 4, Patrol 4.
The situation in Oakland reached such a crisis point in the early 2000s that after a criminal investigation into the department's misconduct, control was transferred to a federal monitor. Chief Went has been working under this federal oversight since he came to office in 2013.
We have an early intervention system that the idea behind it is that if an officer starts having too many uses of force or too many complaints, they'll pick that up early on, and you can then kind of do a review of that particular officer and see is some type of intervention needed. We've seen very significant reductions in uses of force and complaints against police officers.
So we begin this, sir. You can stand underneath the camera there. be dispatched to a domestic abuse call. We determine what your call sign is. I'll start the scenario here, react to what you see.
What's the matter? Come over here, Stephen.
Where is he?
Okay, is this the gentleman? Sir, we got a call for service. We're here to help you. Hey, can you tell me what happened? Step over here.
There's certain strategies that we took to do that. A lot of times do with training. So like, for example, video simulator training. We also do like role play simulator training. And that is all really good training, and that helps officers make better decisions under stress.
After thinking about it, I should have probably stepped away from the door a bit more and I had a piece of cover, but he was standing still.
With the use of force there, as we've discussed before.
And then as far as case law training, we've done a lot of that. We talked about what are the legal requirements to point a firearm. I don't think instinctively cops don't necessarily see that as a use of force, but for somebody that's having a firearm pointed at them by the government, essentially, it can be very traumatic. We went from averaging around 8 officer-involved shootings a year to 2014 not having any at all. We haven't had a fatal officer-involved shooting in over 2 years, and hopefully that will continue.
84055 Street, Apartment 3.
A police officer's role in society, first and foremost, is to protect the communities that they are working in.
Police are just a reflection of their community, so if the police are not treating people with mental illness well, they are a reflection of the lack of empathy in our communities.
I never experienced nothing like this to happen the way it happened on the 15th.
What a police officer's role is not is to be opposed to the community, to be an enemy of the community, or to be an occupier of the community. I think finally the country is waking up to something that has really been a problem for decades.
So one of the things that's, again, I started with a particular question is that has the prevalence of such interactions, use of lethal force, been increasing, or just are we more aware of it because of the prevalence of capturing technology, if I can use that language? And it does seem that the numbers are particularly problematic. And so that begs the question, I'm going to go to some of the numbers and what's bringing people into contact with police. And I mentioned broken windows, I mentioned quality of life initiatives, and other folks call this proactive policing. And I'm zipping through a number of the instances that many people know of: Walter Scott, Laquan McDonald. I mean, unfortunately, I could keep naming people. It's such an increasingly rampant and unfortunate phenomenon. But what's happening is that proactive policing, meaning we want to catch criminality before it escalates to the point that there is death, before the suspect kills someone else. So we're going to proactively engage in certain quote-unquote high crime neighborhoods in an attempt to stop crime before it happens. The trouble is this is predicated upon very low levels of suspicion, and suspicion is often subjectively informed by various identity constructs. And that's where really my notion of SIC, suspect identity construction, comes into the fore. So to the extent that certain people are targeted more than others, those people who are targeted tend to be people who have negatively racialized identities, let's put it that way, and increasingly mental health, either vulnerabilities or who are manifesting through the interaction something that the police deem as crazy. And when I use that language of crazy, I don't mean to be offensive. I use it in the sense of what scholars often call SAS, or situational disobedience. So, and again, these two interactions might be good examples of SAS, or situational disobedience. In the police eyes, when one is not appropriately deferential, as Eric Gardner was deemed to be inappropriately disrespectful and not quick enough in his police response. And this young man was in Gardena, California. He put his hands down, and the video, it's a teenager. It's so just upsetting. He was helping his brother look for a stolen bike. his brother's bike was stolen, and he became the suspect of the bicycle theft. And the police stopped him, and he's with 2 other teenagers. You can't see one of them is behind him. And they told him, keep your hands in the air, and he puts his hands down. He doesn't have anything in his hands. And he's shot multiple times. He was subjectively inappropriate in his lack of deference, perhaps seen as disrespectful, but this begs the question of the police discretion in that instance. And so I'm thinking, what the heck is going on in these encounters, right? What is going on? And I don't purport to have all the answers, but we need to really think seriously about not only the lethal use of force in these encounters, but how it is that the encounters are escalated to the point at which it's appropriate or seen as appropriate and justifiable to shoot a 16-year-old who is or a 17-year-old who is thought to be a bicycle a bicycle thief, right? So Justice O'Connor, when she was sitting on the bench in Atwater, I believe it was, yes, in Atwater, appropriately, I think, problematized the use of unbounded police discretion, right? And she raised this epidemic, particularly as it concerned people of color in minority offense arrests, right? Indeed, as the recent debate over racial profiling demonstrates all too clearly, a relatively minor traffic infraction, or whatever the infraction is, selling cigarettes on the street, for example, serve as an excuse for stopping and harassing an individual, and she continues, right? With respect to the Henry Louis Gates home invasion scenario that took place when, incident which took place when I was still in Boston, when Professor Gates was attempting to enter his home, there was a lot of conversation around that. And some scholars determined that the problem in terms of the force that was used against him was that the police officer felt disrespected, right? So some scholars, including Professor Cooper, who I have the pleasure of working with at Suffolk, has problematized this site, when I say what is going on, as a masculinity contest. And the masculinity does not mandate that the people interacting be men, biologically, let's put it that way, but rather what's going on is a contest around this gendered dynamic of one up, quote unquote, men's ship, right? And so it can happen even when the officers are women and in these situations as well. So police contact may threaten the health of individuals stopped in several ways. We know that. There's lots of information about that. And in this space of what I call felonization, this encounter with suspect identity constructions, it begs the question, does that unpronounceable diagnosis that I mentioned earlier of rascality have anything to do with any of this? Does sass or back chat, or what some scholars call the attitude test, have anything to do with what's going on here? Do notions of respect and masculinity have anything to do with what's going on here? Some scholars have posited, and frankly parents, we know we train our kids to be just shut up, stay quiet, be respectful, kiss ass if you need to, but do not provoke an escalation in the account. And it's sad when we, as many people have confided and confessed and are talking about, that we are instructing our people of color, our young people, to be excessively deferential, even if they know they're right? And what does that do to one's psyche? Knowing that that's just how it's going to be and how it has to be, right? Because you disrespect the officer has ways of showing you that he or she has the last word, as the last quote says, right? And this professor at NYU talks about this in terms of, I mentioned sass, right? The problem with police brutality, he says, is that sometimes officers react with violence to defiance, right? Who do we encounter as more defiant, right? Just like women are encountered as abrasive, right? Lots of literature around that. Who do we encounter as defiant? Has racial tones, right? Minorities might be seen as more defiant and give the cops more sass, subjectively seen, and people who do that are likely to get hit. In this particular case he was talking about, especially if the officer has a racist attitude, right? So when I talked about proactive policing, what are the numbers? What are some of the stats that we see, right? And I've just flashed some of them up. No doubt many of you know this already. Heightened contact with police in terms of Black people and Latinos, because we're stopped more often as motorists, 2 times more likely to be arrested, 3 times more likely to experience force. Nationwide, Black motorists are stopped far more. Black Americans, including, and I thought this was an interesting way to put it, including those who are multiracial, are similarly subjected to increased policing. Nationwide, 16% of persons under the age of 18 are Black, yet 32% of those who are arrested as juveniles, right, to your point earlier, are Black. Among school systems, and we saw some of this with a young woman who was slammed on the, I have that video, but I'm tired of showing this stuff, who was slammed on her desk, right, on the floor from her desk. So disparate numbers in terms of school, quote-unquote, policing and school suspensions, we know that, school-based arrests, school-based referrals. Black youth make up only 16% of public schools, yet we have a very high percentage of students who are expelled, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and there's more information. Interestingly, I came across a stat even that, this many percentage of Black people in the NFL, but they make up like 80% of like, what is it, what's the offense? Misconduct, it's the equivalent of like football misconduct, but behaving inappropriately, can't dance in the end zone, all that stuff, right? The people who know football know this better than I do, and I should know this because Super Bowl's coming, right? But it begs the question of how discretion is used even in situations like sports, okay? So, again, more stats around the case that came out of New York City. We know about stop and frisk. And the question becomes, what does all of this do to all of us? What does this do in terms of these structures, systemic issues, individual issues, interactions? What does the microaggressions that you're studying about, what's the net effect of all of this on our biology, on our predilection for diseases? Epidemiologists have lots to say in terms of how this actually lives in our bodies and lives in our psyches, right? And then if you're in an encounter, the propulsion and the escalation, the cycle is that people who are distressed, stressed, anxious, paranoid, or behaviorally struggling and or coping in unhealthy ways, right? Drugs, alcohol, etc., are more likely to behave in a way that is seen as inappropriate by officers, thereby spiraling further into an escalating situation. It's, so I meditate. I'm joking, but it's what do we do? What do we do, right? What do we do? Even those of us who are here as law students, if we're encountered by a police officer, where our hearts are going to race, we're going to start to sweat. We might manifest, despite the best of education, experience, knowledge, and your brilliance. You might manifest behaviorally in concerns to the officer, which might prolong the interaction, sometimes to your peril, sometimes to our peril, right? So what are the impacts? I flashed some of them up on the screen because I'm running out of time, and I'm thrilled that from the time I started this research when I was in Missouri in, I want to say like 2003, 2002, there's so much more work that has been done around the impacts of isms, whether it's sexism, homophobia, racism, classism, and all of this put together, ableism on our lives. So the good news is more and more people are paying attention. More and more people are paying attention. And there's been lots of grant research from the National Institute of Health and the CDC and the federal government. The Surgeon General has been pouring more research, funding and support into looking at what this means. Also, you know why? Because it costs billions of dollars a year in terms of lost productivity. I would like to think it's out of the empathy and compassion of people's hearts and concerns. But people can empirically, now we know, we can quantify the sort of calling in black phenomena, or when people can't, for whatever reason, or won't, or aren't able to be as productive as they otherwise might, let alone the actual lost productivity from a lost life, right? What we actually lose. So economists are quantifying what this means, right? And experts, you mentioned PTSD, you know, people are now starting to talk about this, the reality in terms of the impacts on people of color and women who are struggling with or victimized by traumatic instances of racism, sexism, etc. All of our visible and invisible identities, right? And the toll that takes. So again, I'm going to stop, and I'm going to stop with. It was funny because I had this on my screen, and my son, who is 17, was like, "Police don't like black people, Mom." Like, you know, sort of looking at the article, he's like, "That's, you know, what are you reading?" And so you know, when I talk about more and more research being done, years ago, as many of these scholars have said in anecdotal, in editorials, that stuff would have not published. You know what I mean? So that's also a concern about, you know, when we send our works out for peer review or student-run journals, will they publish it? So it's interesting in sort of even digging down into some of the work that's being done, and now people are saying because grant funding is coming in, people will increasingly publish things that they wouldn't have published before. So it's sort of the same question. Is there more of this? Is there less? Has this been going on? Previously, it was that much harder because of a lack of awareness to even get the research out there. PhDs behind your name or not, right? So that's also an interesting phenomenon for those of us in these types of university settings, right? Knowledge production, right? How do you get information out there so people can be engaged and in dialogue about it? So I think that's, you know, this is a good step when people are getting their work out there, so we can hopefully do something about what we're encountering and problematize and strategize together. So I'll stop here.
We have time for maybe a question or two.
Hi. I'm with the Revolution. Now I have.
Excellent.
I mean, you know, I'm not a student, but I found the program really interesting. But I guess I have a question. Like, I'm just going to show the fact that I'm in the Revolution. You know, you talk. How do I phrase it? Like, I'm just curious if what you're getting at. You talked about a genocide, which I think is very real. Like, and what you're talking about the nexus, right? On mental health. I mean, that's part of the genocidal policy, right? And so I'm just, you know, I guess to get to the heart of it, it's a system of white supremacy. I mean, that's at the heart of the foundation of things, and that's where all the policies, you know, everything that's shaping, and it's actually taking like a lot of sharp sort of, the contradictions are really sharpening up. You know, you got the Trumps, you got all that stuff. And really, like, you know, there's I don't know, I mean, to me, it's sort of the question of a way forward, because this is U.S. imperialism. I mean, that's at the foundation of it. And so I just feel like there's a gap between sort of, you know, where people are at and where it needs to go, and frankly, to get rid of that with an actual revolution. That's what I would advocate for.
Right, no, you know, and I don't necessarily disagree with you. I don't, you know, and the thing is, you know, and so I'm Jamaican, and I you know, like Bob Marley said, emancipate yourself from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds. And there's a way, and but he also said, like, you know, I won't say, you know, what he said about education, and, you know, there's, and, you know, to make us the fool, right? You know, brainwash education to make us the fool. And as a student of Marley, I'll put it that way, it makes us think, okay, so how much of what we're actually informed of is absolutely to keep us stupid and uneducated and disengaged, right? Because if we know what's actually happening beyond our individual lives, not only is that destabilizing in lots of ways, but you can't help but want to start a revolution, right? I mean, once you're sort of like, your eyes are open, it's hard to shut them again. Especially, you know, if you're going out in the world and you're interacting with people and you have a certain level of empathy, right? And so what does that mean? On the one hand, does it mean that we go into systems and try to bring them down from within, or change them from within, or deconstruct them from within? Or do we go, you know, outside the system to try to totally dismantle the system, right? And, you know, and it's a struggle for me, because I think we have to do both. You know, on the one hand, as a professor, you know, I'm in these systems that I know, and you know the history as with respect to people like us, right? But on the other hand, okay, you know, how do you change something from the outside as well? I think we need to have allies in the struggle. I think we need to have really fortified and viable coalitions. And I do think we have to, more of us have to move into these spaces of quote unquote discretion. Let's put it that way. Because I think wherever there is discretion, it typically is an exercise in favor of women, in favor of, you know, people who are seen as sexual minorities, in favor of people who are, you know, mentally vulnerable, right? Typically, discretion is not exercised in favor of people who have been traditionally marginalized, right? So maybe I'm Pollyannish in hoping that people from non-traditional backgrounds will exercise discretion better or differently, because maybe it just corrupts, right? But I do think what we're talking about, you're right, is figuring out how do we start over, and I think the first step is honestly awareness. I think knowing and seeing, and then hopefully feeling with respect to some of what's going on will propel action. And I think people who are at institutions like UCLA, frankly, have a special and not prerogative, but power. Because there's a credibility that comes from being affiliated and a part of an institution that is so highly regarded. You have a voice, more than most people. You know what I mean? Because you have UCLA behind you, or because you're here, or whatever. Like I think, and I don't think that should be diminished. And I think that's why many of us go into law, you know, because it gives voice to people, to those of us who otherwise no one would listen to me. You know, I'm just another dreadlocked Jamaican on the street. Right? No, look, that's, you know, and when I leave, I am again, right? It doesn't matter. It's not like I walk around and everyone knows anything, right? So I think there's ways in which we have to think about, well, how do we use the power that we have, however constrained?
One of the videos you showed, somebody said that the police are merely a reflection of society. And I don't think that she was saying it as a justification, but it did make me think that a lot of the work that I've done around holding police accountable and that sort of thing, I have thought about it as something they're doing to us. I haven't really put it, I haven't really put that piece into place where it's a reflection of the way everybody is kind of acting, right? Like, oh yeah, you know, American society in general doesn't really seem to have a lot of compassion or empathy for folks with mental health issues. Right. So I just wondered what you thought about that. Like, is that, do we need to reorient the way that we think about this whole policing thing? Because I mean, it's about what all of us are doing in some ways.
So I would say yes to that, the latter question, because I was in Turkey at a conference on racism and discrimination, and they had an interesting panel on racism in the United States, because it's always easier to talk about somewhere else, right? Than to actually, you know, and you know what I mean? It's always interesting to point the finger first, right? Because and every country has their own stuff. You just change the face and the, you know what I mean? The immigration status or the refugees. Every country, right, has their. It's just we know as much about it. So I was on this plenary panel in Istanbul in the fall, and someone asked a question similar to that, and I said, you know, one of the things that we have to understand, and I do think this is, police are us. We are police. Do you know what I mean? Like I don't know if. And that begs the question, should more of us go into policing, right? But it begs that question when I say about going into structures and changing systems. But I think that we, in a way, they just have weapons, right? And have the authority to go into certain spaces that I can't just walk into and be like, what are you doing over here? Let me see your ID, right? So the difference is I think they're empowered to engage and are weaponized, right? And they manifest the same toxicity that the rest of us have, that we know we all have, but from the implicit biases, right? And if you read, as I really need to stop doing, the editorials, like when you go down and you read the comments, and all of the media report, like, then you see that it's not just the police. Like you see, like the stuff that people write, sometimes they put their name, sometimes they don't, but you think, oh, it makes your heart hurt, right? When you actually start, you know, and you could be talking about a child being killed. And you know what I mean? So I think there's a lot that's really disturbing in our communities, and that people would actually take the steps sometimes to even share that. And you can just YouTube and you can look at like things that people say into the their phones and stuff. So I think police are just a proxy for what is actually fairly deep-seated, but weaponized.
In one of the videos, there was just a brief comment that was saying that how we dealt with mental health in America has gotten worse over time. Do you have any comments about the systems that were in place before that were better?
Sure. So I think that was referring to deinstitutionalization that really, I think, ramped up in the 70s and the 80s. So for example, the town in which I grew up is Whitby, Ontario, and our big quote-unquote industry was the Whitby Psych, which is what we called, was the Whitby Psychiatric Hospital. And thousands of people were employed by this massive hospital on Lake Ontario, including both of my parents, right? Little by little, that institution has been shrunk. And like many other institutions, and sort of funding has been moved or morphed and changed, and this is exactly what's happened in the States as well. So more and more people who are actually residents of the institutions, right, and receiving regular treatment and regular medication that was funded by the governments, right, and are now on the streets, right? And combine that, a lot of research tells us, with people who are coming back from multiple wars in the States. I mean, you think about it, in you know, how many wars have been taking place with people who have seen all sorts of horrible things and experienced all sorts of trauma. And then we don't have the world's best yet Veterans Affairs in terms of care for them. Many of people end up on the street. So the combination of deinstitutionalization of psychiatric hospitals, homelessness combined with veterans who are displaced, I'll put it that way, it brings even more police into contact with people on the streets. Oh, so here's what I struggle with. I struggle with not feeling depressed about this, right? So I would want to end on, like, no, seriously, like, you know, and so I share that with you, sort of like, hope it's not like too much information, but I share that with you because I think there's a way in which we can go like, I just don't want to deal with this, and which is what I periodically do, totally honestly. And so my hope is that when we see improvements, even the fact that, you know, what we saw in Oakland, people are, partly because of the national scandal that this is, if not international scandal, police departments, I do think, are trying to deal with these situations. I'm not saying it's all perfect, but that creates space for people like you to enter conversations that we weren't having before. So I think the fact that there's increased awareness, increased, even though the media sometimes is very hard to you know, digest everything, I think there's a potential for good to come out of this in the next decade or so, right? So I hope to see some progress. And frankly, because you showed up, so, you know, so thank you.
Thank you.
Now have a great evening.
Thank you.